Okay, almost there. All right. Up and running.
There it is.
One of the most famous chapters in the entire Torah. We'll give it a minute or two, but I do want to try and start relatively close to the official starting time because we've got a lot of material to go through. I'm afraid I might have tried to squeeze too much into this one, but we'll see. I mean, it's impossible to say everything that has been said about the Akedah, about this chapter, simply because entire books have been written about it. But I did want to provide at least some more context and information and some of the classical understandings because it is such a critical text and such a very, very important one. All right. Well, like I said, I want to get as much time into this as possible. So only 2 minutes late still seems early to me. So let's go ahead and get going. Again, we are going to be studying chapter 22 of the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis. This is better known as the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. As you can probably guess, then, this is the chapter which tells the story of the command and the fulfillment of Abraham to bind up Isaac. Now, at the heart of this story is this word nisa, this word of testing. And trying to understand the Akedah is really going to hinge upon how we understand why there was a test, what the test involved, how Abraham did on the test, and all of the later ramifications. So keep that in mind as we go through. Unusual for our normal style, we're going to read through the entire chapter. I'm going to point out a few of the Hebrew linguistic insights that are hidden by the translation, unfortunately, and then we will dive into our commentary, which will focus more on the setting everything up, but hopefully by having the whole chapter, we'll have a chance to also debrief at the end with our own feelings on how Abraham did on this test and what the test was really trying to accomplish. With that in mind, let's get down to it. Sometime afterward. Interesting start. After what? Could it be immediately after what we just saw before in chapter 21? Well, we'll have to come back to that. But sometime afterward, God put Abraham to the test. He said to him, Abraham, and he answered, here I am, or hineni, as it says in the Hebrew, a very famous word, usually showing the readiness of the respondent to whatever the caller has reached out for. And he said, take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, which, again, translator, please, take your son, your favored one, whom you love, Isaac, is the actual phrasing that is used in the Torah for very good reasons, as we will see, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you. All right, so two very important literary things that are missed in this translation. And every translation has to interpret, but sometimes it's hard when the interpretation closes off avenues of discussion. So first, you may notice that the command that is begun here is lech lecha. That may sound familiar. Way back at the beginning of Avram, when he was still known as Avram, at his journey with God, he was given the command lech lecha. That was the command to leave and go to the land of Canaan. Well, now he is getting the command again, lech lecha, except this time he is not going to the land of Canaan, he is going to the land of Moriah. And apparently when he gets there, he has to do something. And what is it that he has to do there? Beha'alehu sham, right? That le'olah, that he has to, well, actually, this is going to be a word that we're going to have to wrestle with. The translation here is very straightforward: offer him as a burnt offering, which is perfectly reasonable. And olah is a burnt offering. However, the verb, v'ha'alehu, while it definitely has the him as the direct object as part of the suffix, v'ha'alehu could mean to offer it as a burnt offering. It can also mean to go up or to conduct with him a burnt offering. There is room for ambiguity on this word, and as we'll see in our commentary, that is important. And we don't even know exactly which mountain it'll be. That will be mentioned later on. So early next morning, Avraham saddled his ass and took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. He split the wood for the burnt offering, and he set out for the place which God had told him. So we see Abraham's zeal by getting up quick in the morning. We see that he is willing to do the work himself by splitting the wood. We also see that he is not bringing any particular offering with him. So he definitely seems to be interpreting the command of verse 2 as probably Isaac will be the sacrifice. At least that might be our interpretation at this point. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place from afar. So eventually, 3 days after beginning and getting into the right region, now he is seeing the place and knows this is where God wants him to perform the deed. All right, is everybody with me so far? Any questions or comments? All right. Scroll down to get more of the text on at one time. Then Abraham said to his servants, "You stay here with the ass. The boy and I will go up there. We will worship and we will return to you." All right, a couple things to note here. First of all, the servants are staying behind. That's going to play an important role later on in our analysis of what this might have been attempting to achieve. Secondly, he is talking about Isaac as a another kid. He's not naming Isaac directly, which could be part of his emotional distancing during this act as he thinks he is going to sacrifice. And third, he finishes with what might be a lie, because he says, "We will return to you." If Abraham is actually planning to sacrifice Isaac, meaning to kill him, then there will be no we on the return trip. Instead, it will only be Abraham coming back. So perhaps Abraham is lying. Perhaps he believes that he will not, in the end, do the sacrifice, that he may go up for it, but he will not carry it out. He may indeed be ambivalent at this point, or at the very least confused about what will be expected of him at the end. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and put it on his son. Again, literarily, this is a very beautiful bit of writing style. He takes the wood and he puts it on his son. So first of all, just the pain that we as a reader who believe that Abraham is about to sacrifice Isaac, the pain of putting the wood upon which Isaac will be burnt onto Isaac instead is a little bit of insult to injury. Also, by putting the wood on Isaac, he is inverting the normal practice of a sacrifice. Normally, the sacrifice is put on the wood. The wood is not put on the sacrifice. So we can tell that this world is upside down at the moment. He took the firestone, meaning like the flint used for kindling the fire, and the knife, and the two walked off together. That little word at the end, yachdav, is going to be very important as a repeated motif when we go further along, that they seem to be moving with a togetherness of purpose, remembering that the word yachdav comes from the Hebrew word echad, meaning one. Then Isaac said to his father, Abraham, "Father," right? He says, "Avi," he calls out to his dad. And he answered, "Yes, my son," which, again, the translator, missing an opportunity. You may remember back in verse 1, when God calls out to Abraham, Abraham's response is, "Hineni." Here, where his son calls out to Abraham, his answer is hineni. It's the same term. And yet the translator has chosen to translate it as yes, rather than here I am. Why? I really can't tell you. This seems to be an attempt to make it sound more natural in the English, because usually if you're having a conversation with a family member and they say, hey, Dad, you wouldn't turn around and say, here I am. But in a conversation with God, that sounds normal in English. In Hebrew, the answer hineni for both of them is perfectly fine, acceptable, and it is meant to be an echo, that he answers his son the way he answered his God, and that he answers his son by saying, Beni, you are my son. He had shown some distance. Now he is also showing the closeness that he feels, and the same enthusiasm, the same speed with which he would respond to God's call, he is giving to his son. This is not a callous, distant father. This is not somebody who is uncaring or unthinking. This is somebody who is attentive to his child. And he, meaning Isaac, said, here are the firestone and the wood, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering? Isaac is apparently a very bright man. He notices that they're going up for a sacrifice. He knows that they have the fire and they have the wood for the sacrifice, but they seem to be missing an animal for the sacrifice. And he is asking about that issue. You'll notice that he is also leaving out a very important word, the knife. He asks about the firestone and the wood, but he does not ask about the knife, which figured prominently in the previous verse. So he may indeed harbor a few suspicions about what's about to happen. And that seems to be a little unsettling. And so he doesn't mention the knife at all. Any questions or comments before we see how Abraham tries to comfort his son?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
How old is Isaac at this point? Because you referred to him as in the text son, but then you say he's a man.
And I am being deliberately ambiguous.
So, I mean, how old?
Because
we've
the
had
tradition,
this discussion before.
We have had this discussion before when we talk about the age of Rivka, his soon-to-be wife. So Isaac is either a young man, meaning probably in his teenage years, or he is somewhere in his 30s. It is hard to know precisely from the text itself, because there are clues that point in different directions. So, for example, he is referred to by his father as a na'ar. Now, a na'ar usually means a young lad, which would put us back into the teenage camp. However, the term na'ar can also just mean an attendant, a social status, as opposed to an age status. And so that's unclear. And then, like I said, in previous classes, we've talked about Isaac's age comparison to the age of his bride. And that's where it gets seemingly more likely that he is a bit older, especially when we try to compute it with the age of Sarah, which, if we say that she dies immediately after this sacrifice, which is chronologically, in terms of the text where it comes, would also put him at an older time. So it is difficult to know exactly how old Isaac is during all of this. So I will leave it up to each reader to sort of envision Isaac at the age that they are comfortable with. But at the very least, he is not a yellet. He is not a little boy. At the very least, we would imagine that him to be a teenager.
Okay, because all children's books always show him as a little boy. And
yes, which I think was designed by the authors to terrorize children.
That's wrong. It's the wrong image.
Well, because, I mean, in children's books, to be fair to the authors and the illustrators, in the average children book, if you say a boy and his father went for a walk, nobody's going to draw a picture of a teenager, even if all the information you gave was a boy and his father. I am willing to bet if you asked 100 people on the street to draw a stick figure of a boy and his father going for a walk, they're going to draw the father this big and the boy this big. It's simply the natural assumption that most people make. What the Torah always tells us, however, is you have to go past your natural assumption. Just because you immediately think of somebody as being a child or as an older adult doesn't mean that's the right image. I mean, because let's be honest here, we know that Abraham is at least well over 100 years old at this point. And that means that the image of a father as like some middle-aged suburban dad is also not correct. He is more of a great-grandfather figure as far as what he would look like in person. So there's a lot that's going on here that we have to readjust our prior assumptions for if we want to make any sense of it at all. And Abraham's response to his son is equally clever and, well, confusing. And Abraham said, God will see to the sheep for his burnt offering, my son. And the two of them walk on together. Again, they are walking yachtav. They are walking together. Now, the thing is that this particular verse can be read in a couple of different ways if you read it in the Hebrew. You can read it instead by saying, God will see to the sheep, pause, for an offering, beni, my son, which would imply God will see to the sheep, and that sheep is you, or God will see to the sheep, and if there is no sheep, then the sacrifice will be you. Or, as this translator has put it, God will see to the sheep, meaning God will provide a sheep. And that sheep will be for the sacrifice. And my son is just the tagline at the end, again, bracketing his conversation when he began with the phrase beni and he finishes with the phrase beni. He starts with my son and he finishes with my son. Whichever way you want to read that, Isaac seems to be okay. Isaac goes along with it. They are still walking together, yachtav. And now we get to the action sequence. They arrive at the place which God had told him. Abraham built an altar there. He laid out the wood. He bound his son Isaac. That's where the phrase akedah comes from. He laid him on the altar on top of the wood. So now the wood and the person are inverted again. Now Isaac is on the top, and Isaac is being prepared for a sacrifice. It is clear at this point that what we heard about in the early verse 2, is very clear for Abraham that he is intending to sacrifice his son, Isaac, as an actual olah, as a sacrificial offering. And Abraham picked up the knife to slay his son. Slay is perhaps not the best word. Slaughter would be a better word, even though slaughter is tricky in English. Lishchot has the phrase, has the connotation of a ritual sacrifice. It is not a murder. It is not a violent act. This is not, leaping out behind somebody in an alley with a knife. This is a clean kill of how you handle a sacrifice. And again, we get that repeat again now, second verse in a row with Beno, his son, that the sonness of Isaac is clearly very prominent. Then an angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, Avraham, Avraham. He answered, Hineni, here I am. And again, the translator goes back to here I am, but you can see how having him answer God originally, having him answer his son, and having him answer the angel at the end with the same phrase, Hineni, would have been a much more powerful motif to keep running throughout the text. It's clear in the Hebrew, the English muddies it a little bit. So this angel is calling out to Abraham, and Abraham again answers the angel. And he said, meaning the angel, do not raise your hand against the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your favored one, from me. All right, so don't do anything else. Now, he already had raised his hand, but basically don't do anything more than what you have done. For now I know that you fear God. Remember, fear is not a trembling in the corner kind of fear usually. This is the overpowering awe of something that you recognize as more powerful than yourself. But notice the end here as well. Since you have not withheld your son, your favored one, from me. That is not quite the set of adjectives that we had back up in verse 2, which I'm just going to go back to help you remember. So what is missing from our verse 2 list and the verse that we are on? Take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, verses, just a second, come on, sometimes the mouse doesn't work. Your son, your favored one, done. So what's missing? Nobody wants to chime in? All right, just to make sure that we don't run out of time, I will go ahead and point it out to you. First of all, Isaac as a name is missed, but perhaps even more poignantly, the one whom you love is not contained in this list. You may notice that the phrase favored one in the Hebrew, again, to continue the literary technique that was throughout, is known as yechidcha. It's the your single one, which is that same root that we had for yachtav the other times before. So they are together, they are together, they are together, but now the loving adjective is no longer there. When Abraham looked up, or rather when he lifted up his eye fell upon, he saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in place of his son. Again, that phrase beno coming up again, and the phrase tachat for the sacrifice is being used both as instead of, but it can also be meant as under. So it could have been that he simply put the animal under Isaac and slaughtered it. So it was almost a pantomime of a sacrifice of Isaac, but with the animal dying instead. It's like a surrogate sacrifice, but with the person on top of it, would be another way to read this. And again, we get now much more clearly the Yalehu La'olah, that he offered it up as a sacrifice, as an olah, instead of his son. And Abraham named the site Adonai Yireh, whence the present saying, on the mount of the Lord there is vision. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I swear, the Lord declares, because you have done this and not withheld your son, your favorite one, again, a shorter version, I will bestow my blessing upon you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sands of the seashore. And your descendants shall seize the gates of their foes. All the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by your descendants because you have obeyed my command. Or more specifically, because you have listened to my voice or hearkened to my voice. Abraham then returned to his servants, and they departed together. Again, one last yachtav for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. So there's a lot that happens in these last three verses, but I didn't want to interrupt the flow. So first of all, we'll notice that this continued conversation with Abraham is through a malach, through an angel. We began with Adonai speaking directly. Now we are seeing a malach, an angel. And that is a unsettling change given what has just happened. And indeed, we don't see a direct conversation between Adonai and Abraham for the rest of Abraham's life. Additionally, we don't see a conversation between Isaac and Abraham for the rest of their life. And as we see in verse 19, Abraham returns to the other Na'arim, the other lads, the other servants, and it is they that are now yachtav. Isaac is not mentioned at this point. Isaac does not seem to be traveling with his father back from this event. Or at the very least, if they are traveling back, they are no longer traveling yachtav together. Perhaps at this point there is some distance, shall we say, created between father and son. Perhaps that is a healthy distance, Perhaps not, depending upon the way you wish to interpret this. All right, any questions on the text itself? We'll get to the overall interpretation of what this test was all about and Abraham's score, but I want to do that after we finish our commentary. So, but any questions on the text in and of itself that we should discuss before we get to that? All right. And again, we are just touching scratching the tip of the iceberg here. There is so much more to say, but we've only got an hour. And as it is, I'm already going to be breaking my rule of having only 2 pages. We're going to end up with 3 verses of commentary. So please bear with me. For our reference set, we have this first text that we began with in order that we can refer to it as needed more easily. So what is this trial, this Nisa activity that is happening here with Avraham? Well, let's begin with Ramban. The matter of trial, in my opinion, is as follows. Since a man's deeds are at his absolute free command to perform them or not to perform them at his will, on the part of one who is tried, it is called a trial. So if from a person's point of view, their deeds, their decisions are entirely up to them, right? I can choose to lift my cup or put my cup down, and whether I lift it or whether I put it down is entirely up to me. I have 100% free will. So whether I do it or not at the right moment, in the right way, for the right reasons, that is a test. That is a trial. That is up to me. But on the part of the Holy One, blessed be he, who tries the person who, this is God who actually put the trial in place, it is a command that one being tested should bring forth the matter from potential into actuality, so that he may be rewarded for a good deed, not for a good thought alone. So first and foremost, says Ramban, the trial, when God says, lift the cup, and you choose to lift the cup, what God is doing is not seeing if you'll lift the cup, but is giving you the opportunity to lift the cup so that you go from being a cup lifter in principle to being a cup lifter in action. If God commands you to give to the poor and you want to give to the poor, that's nice, but actually putting that into reality is where there is reward, where there is a concrete action, there can be a concrete response, moving it from thought to deed. Now, why is it important to make this distinction, says Ramban? Well, know further that God tries the righteous, for knowing that the righteous will do his will, he desires to make him even more upright, and so he commands him to undertake a test. But he does not try the wicked, who would not obey. Thus, all trials in the Torah are for the good of the one who is being tried. So this principle that Ramban is trying to argue for here, is that you know that somebody is being tried if you know that they are a good person. If they're not a good person, then what they're undergoing is not a trial, it is not a test, because a test is only done for those that God knows will do the right thing, that they will fulfill the commandment, that they will listen to God's voice, they will do God's will. And because God knows they will, the trial is an opportunity for them to earn the reward that comes from having fulfilled it. Now, that is still a perfectly fair trial, because as far as the human is concerned, they have 100% free will. They are choosing to do it or not do it. The fact that God knows the outcome doesn't make it an unfair test. It just means that God is choosing well who to try and who not to try. This also means, of course, that not all things that are difficult in life are actually trials. Some of them we may fail. Some of them we may choose wrong. That does not mean they were put there to punish us. It only means that when there is a trial that we overcome, that trial was indeed an opportunity for us to grow by having fulfilled it. All right. Now, not everybody agrees with Ramban. There are other ways to look at this notion of a test. And one of those is chizkunim. Another interpretation, one which places the emphasis on the word, he tested Avraham. Avraham was not tested in order for God to convince himself, God's self, of his willingness to offer up his beloved son, seeing that such matters are known to him. who is omniscient, he, Avraham, was tested by the attribute of justice, which had dared question the degree of loyalty he could summon when so tested. Passing this test successfully would convince the people around him of the absolute obedience to any command God would issue to him. There was no way the nations of the world could challenge his faith thereafter. So it's not just about God proving to God's self, because obviously that God already knows. And it's not about proving or providing an opportunity for the righteous to earn the reward of having overcome the challenge. But it was also about demonstrating to the rest of the world so that it would be revealed and they would understand that it was indeed just that God was doing what he did for Avraham, because it would be revealed by Avraham's public behavior that he indeed was willing to listen to God and fulfill God's commands. That a trial was necessary, much like what Ramban said, to move it from potential to actual, but the actual here was more important, a display to those that were around the person being tested. Right? How will you know if a person is good, if not by the deeds that they perform? And how will you know the greatness of a person's goodness? By the magnitude of the deeds that they perform. God was giving Avraham an opportunity to perform the greatest of deeds so that people would understand he had the greatest of faith in God. Everybody with me so far? All right. So if I'm not mistaken, this next one, yes, is Ibn Ezra is going to put a few twists on this and push back on some of the interpretations. Some say that the word nisa, prove or tested, is a variation of nisa, phonetically the same, meaning to lift up. And indeed, we see Abraham lifting his eyes with that verb at the end of the chapter, with the sin replacing the samach and the hey replacing the aleph, meaning that it's another variation of spelling. As they are homonyms, this could be very easy. However, the plain meaning of the entire chapter contradicts this interpretation. Right? The word nisa, meaning prove or tested, should be taken literally. That this was not just God lifting up Abraham, that there was an actual test taking place in this process, that there was a challenge to be overcome. The philosophers teach that there are two kinds of knowledge: knowledge of events prior to their occurrence and knowledge of what is presently in existence. You have knowledge before something happens, and then you have knowledge of it happened or it is happening. The latter is the meaning of God did prove or God did test. And as we saw at the end, and for now I know. I just want to take a quick deviation here to do a little English lesson. The word prove or proof in English originally and officially still has a connotation of something that has actually been shown to do something that it was claimed to do. So, for example, in the old days of armor, you would do a proof test on armor. You would prove the armor by shooting a musket ball at it, and there would be a dent in the armor, but no hole. And then you would show that as the proof of the armor, proof that it would indeed stop a musket ball. So proving has this notion in English of having been tested, and the result speaks for itself. And that is the same reason why, although it's a bit tortuous, we say the proof is in the pudding. More originally, the phrase was the proof of the pudding is in the eating, meaning that you have to actually do something before you know if something is good. And that's what is being used. The word prove is being used here in this analysis, that you needed to move it from a hypothetical knowledge, which is still knowledge in the idea of this epistemology, to an actual knowledge. Sadia Gaon, one of the great teachers of our people who came before Ibn Ezra, says that did prove or did test means that God tested Avraham in order to demonstrate his piety to mankind, similar to Chizkuni's interpretation. Furthermore, he interprets, for now I know you are a God-fearing man, to mean that now I have made known to all that you are a God-fearing man. Again, very similar to Chizkuni's opinion. But, says Ibn Ezra, didn't Sadia know that even Abraham's young men, those Na'arav, were not present when he bound Isaac and placed him on the altar? So how can you say that the Akedah was there to prove, meaning to make known to everyone else 100% that this test had been passed? How could you make that prove to the world if the world wasn't there to witness it? Because very explicitly and kind of incongruously, those two guys are told to stay behind while he goes up by himself. So that doesn't make this much of a public test. And as such, he is arguing that both Sadia and our Chizkuni argument don't make a lot of sense. Others say that, and offer him there for a burnt offering, meaning that phrase, is to be interpreted as bring him up to the mountain, meaning that just bring him to the mountain, and this will be considered as if you brought him up as a burnt offering. That it was a metaphor, if you will, that it was a symbolic act and never was intended by anyone to imagine that would result in the death of Isaac. However, Avraham did not understand his prophetic vision and hurried to sacrifice Isaac, meaning, but what happened was different than what God asked. That God asked for this metaphorical bringing of your son like a sacrifice, and Abraham misunderstood and began to try and sacrifice Isaac literally. God then told him, I did not ask you to slay Isaac, right? That wasn't actually in the text, right? It says that Abraham lifted the knife lishchot, as we talked about, to slaughter, but slaughtering was never used in the original command. And these commentators argue, therefore, God didn't mean for Isaac to be slaughtered, because how could we imagine God would even hint that? We find a similar occurrence in connection with the prophet Jeremiah, who was commanded to go to the house of the Rechabites and to give them wine to drink. Again, another symbolic action. Now, these Geonim offer the above interpretations because, as I think many of us can agree with, they held it not possible that God would issue a command and then take it back. It sounds like God is almost teasing Abraham. Kill your son, don't kill your son. Seems really, really problematic. However, they overlooked the fact that God took the firstborn to serve him, and after a year replaced them with the Levites. In the Exodus from Egypt, we are told that the firstborn will serve God, and then we are told the Levites will do that same job, and that there is a redemption, pidyon haben, for the firstborn instead. That seems like God made one command and then replaced it with another command at a later time. So if that is possible with the commands that are found for our leaving Egypt, why would it not also be possible for God to make one command and then replace it with a different command with regards to Abraham? In reality, all questions are removed by scriptures first stating that God did prove Abraham, did test Abraham. The reason God tested Abraham was in order to reward him. So Ibn Ezra legitimately believes that the original command was to take him up and to sacrifice Isaac, to kill him. And then God rescinded that first command and replaced it with a second command not to harm him, in order that Abraham would have that window of opportunity where he was asked to do the most terrible of deeds, in which he could earn the reward from having gone through with it as far as possible without actually killing his son. And of course, to then get a double bonus by listening to the command not to kill his son. Now, for many people, that may be hard to understand because we have in the modern world denigrated those who change their mind, and to be consistent even at the sacrifice of something we value greatly is considered a virtue by many. But Ibn Ezra is saying, no, it was a virtue to act in the first way when that was the command, and it was a virtue to not act in that way when the command was changed. And that to be flexible and willing to respond to the different command is in fact part of Abraham's strength. That he was willing to stop when God told him to stop is as much of a command and much of a virtue as being willing to slaughter when God gave the command to slaughter. All right, questions and comments before we move on to why the test and this test was taking place at this point. Our phrase being, again, after all these things, as we saw. All right, so why test now? The events after these things, after these events referred to are Abraham's various adventure, the tortuous route to becoming Isaac's father at an advanced age, right? Abraham has had a rough time over the last 10 chapters, and he only just finally was able to have Isaac not only be born, but also weaned and begin the process of growing. In the meantime, Isaac had grown up since we find Abraham as described as living in the land of Philistines for many years. And Isaac was born during the first year of Abraham's stay there. The test assumed much greater impact in view of the repeated promises God had made to Abraham concerning Isaac and his future. To be told at this stage to offer Isaac as a sacrifice and not to hesitate or challenge God's command or even ask for an explanation. You may have noticed that Abraham jumped right to it and didn't have a conversation. He did, in the previous chapters, argue with God about the saving of Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities of the plain. Here, he does not argue at all. When he was told to send away Ishmael, he also had more moral reservations in his discussion with God. Here, when he is told to sacrifice Isaac, he jumped to it directly. And that is surprising. And this is a tremendous act of obedience, says Or HaChaim. And of course, Isaac, too, since he has grown up and is not merely an infant, deserves credit for submitting, because Isaac was a willing participant. He was Yachdav. He was together with Abraham on this. Another reason the Torah wrote after these events is that only now could God refer to Isaac as Abraham's only son. As long as Ishmael had not been expelled by Abraham, the description "your only son" would not have been appropriate, because after all, Abraham had two sons. But Ishmael was already gone, having been sent away. Therefore, the loss of Isaac would be an even more painful test for Abraham to go through. So the magnitude of the test, says Or HaChaim, could only be achieved once all these other pieces had been put in place. All the other chapters had to take place in order for this to be the greatest test that Abraham would have to face. His logic makes sense? Everybody absorbing that? Okay. Rashbam, of course, has a different view. Whenever we find the construction after these things, what follows is conceptually immediately following what has been reported immediately before. For example, examples are found in 15:1, after Abraham had killed the 4 kings who had taken Lot captive. And at that time, God told him not to be afraid of any repercussions. And you can see other examples from 22:20, what we saw later on, and from Esther 3:1. Here too, meaning in the Akedah, the words mean that what follows occurred after Abraham and Abimelech had concluded a covenant, according to which, until the 4th generation, Abraham's descendants would not register a claim against the lands owned by the Philistines at this time. God became angry at this arrogant action of Abraham. Presumptuous action might also be a better way, seeing that he had given away lands which were part of what God had promised to Abraham and his descendants at the covenant of the pieces that we saw back in chapter 15. So Rashbam is taking a more narrow view, that this test happened not because it was the culmination of all the other events, like Or HaChaim had said, but rather it happened as an immediate response to what Abraham had just done in the previous chapter. That indeed Abraham had made a mistake, that by making the deal with Abimelech, by seeking peace through his appeasement, we might say, his Chamberlain moment, that he was setting up a very bad situation for his descendants. And indeed, the Philistines do remain a problem for our people for another 800 years. So that is why God decided that another test was necessary. If Abraham had relied upon God to protect him and his family, and not need to capitulate to the Philistines, then perhaps this test would not have occurred. That this was a immediate response to show him that indeed the life of his children were not going to be ultimately established by sharing a few sheep with the Philistines, but that the life of his children would be established in the hands of God and through their connection with God. So this takes, in a sense, a more negative approach. All right, but exactly how is this a test? What is it that Abraham is being asked to do? Why is this test a test? What is the, if you were to put this in a more contemporary language, what is the actual question that is being answered by this test? Now, we saw in our original discussion, but here for review, and he said, take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you. And as I mentioned earlier, the phrase "V'ha'alehu sham le'olah" is just ambiguous enough that other commentators have already said it could be understood either as a metaphor or to do an offering or as an offering. And that may be part of our issue. But let's look at some of the general discussion. Avraham underwent 10 trials of his faith. Avraham scored perfect marks each time. We know that from Pirkei Avot, chapter 5. The first one commenced with the words Lech Lecha, and the last one concluded with the introduction of Lech Lecha. The first trial was leave your country. The last one was the binding of Isaac. So what Rabbeinu Bachya is trying to point out here is that it was the act of severing ties from his family originally that was introduced by Lech Lecha, and therefore the act at the end, which was introduced by Lech Lecha, similarly was involving the almost severing of ties with his son Isaac. And that puts Rabbeinu Bachya in the camp that Avraham was indeed being asked and felt he was being asked and acted as though he were asked to carry out the actual sacrifice. And that the parallelism of Lech Lecha is what is letting us know that just as he was leaving his family, the land of his birth, so too here he is, in a sense, leaving the next generation, cutting off what was in front or behind him and ancestors, cutting off what is next in the form of descendants. And that was the test that he was willing to overcome. However, Radak has a different view. The vision takes place at night, seeing that immediately afterwards the Torah reports Avraham as rising early in the morning. Now, this is a general principle that Rambam goes into more detail about, that all of the other prophets, Avraham included, encountered God through nightly visions rather than through more face-to-face encounters as it is idiomatically expressed with regard to Moses. So what difference does it make that this happened at night? Well, says Ralbag, and the context of this test, in my opinion, was in the coming of the prophecy to him in unclear wording, right? This is a vision at night. We shouldn't expect this to be the same type of clarity that Moshe gets. And thus, this is what the Lord, may he be blessed, said to him about Isaac, and bring him up there for a burnt offering, burnt sacrifice. And this statement can be logically understood to mean that he should slaughter him and offer him as a burnt offering. And it can be logically understood that he should bring him up there to offer a burnt offering in order that Isaac be trained in the service of God. The Lord tested him whether it would be difficult in his eyes to do anything that the Lord would command him about Isaac, to the point that it would become the cause for him to understand the statement other than what is understood from it upon immediate consideration. Meaning to say that that which is understood from it is that he should offer up another burnt offering, not that he should slaughter his son. So this test was given in a way that was deliberately ambiguous, says Ralbag, that was deliberately created so that you could read the sentence in either direction and still be complying with the grammatical logic of the sentence. But it's not just enough to be able to adhere to the grammatical logic. You have to also be sure that as you interpret the grammar, that as you interpret the verse, interpret the vision, this night experience that Avraham had, that you would come to the right answer. And that propensity to misinterpret, especially potentially over the case of his own child, was the issue. And that is what Ralbag says was really the test here. It wasn't the test to see whether he would do it. It was the test to see how he would interpret it if that was one of the options that was available to him. Indeed, this is the type of test I believe that all of us continue to go through, as we are often more likely to interpret things, sometimes well against their logical meaning, if it fits with what we already believe, or if it leads us to a more personally satisfactory or maybe even selfish conclusion. That challenge of allowing our interpretation to be guided by the larger picture of what God is trying to show us is still a challenge, I think, for all of us today. I think I saw somebody unmute. Was there a comment or question?
Yes. I'm thinking back to the text where Isaac asks, "Where's the offering?" And his father replies, "God will provide the lamb." Does that kind of hint at the fact that Abraham doesn't really believe that God is really going to let him kill his own son?
Yes, it is absolutely possible to read that verse as part of Abraham's own sense of ambiguity, that he is going to go up and he is following through the steps as far as he can understand them so far, which is, I'm going to the mountain, there's going to be a sacrifice, my son needs to be there. I'm not going to say it's him yet, maybe, but I'm also not going to take a sheep with me from my extensive herds or flocks, because I also don't think it's supposed to be my sheep that's going, that God didn't tell me to take a sheep. So I'm kind of playing it out as far as I can, leaving open the door for there'll be a sheep there. But if there isn't a sheep there, I might also just go ahead and do the slaughter. So this could be Avraham in that answer to Yitzchak hedging his bets of saying, God's going to take care of the sacrifice. My son? Or basically, we're going to see how this plays out. And that indeed it would be a perfectly legitimate reading of that verse. All right, but I want to make sure that we finish off with Rashi's answer here, just so we get the more classic interpretation of how Avraham, in fact, was unclear, ambivalent, and not 100% gung-ho, as we might have otherwise interpreted, and that there was indeed ambiguity, and that God was not asking for a human sacrifice. Your son, the phrase that we find as the beginning of God's command here, Avraham said to God, I have two sons. He answered him, your only son. Avraham said, this one is the only son of his mother, and the other is the only son of his mother. Right? I've got two only children. God then said, the one whom you love. Avraham replied, I love both of them, Ishmael and Yitzchak. Whereupon God said, Yitzchak. So Rashi, by bringing Genesis Rabbah here, is answering the question of why did God need all of those titles? Why did he have to say, your son, you're the only one, the one you love, and then get to Isaac? It's because Abraham kept stalling, kept arguing, kept pushing back when God was giving him that list. And it was only by saying Isaac that Avraham had to sort of admit, okay, fine, I know what you're asking. But then we have the question, why did he not disclose this to him at the first point? Why not just say, take Isaac and sacrifice him. Why go through the list? So as not to confuse him suddenly, lest his mind become distracted and bewildered, and in his confused state, he would involuntarily consent, when there would have been no merit in his sacrifice, and so that he might more highly value God's command, and that God might reward him for the increasing sacrifice demanded by obedience to each and every expression used here. So the Midrash is trying to say that God had to build him up to it, partly so that he would understand the enormity of what was being asked of him, but also so that he would actually be agreeing with full presence of mind to what was being asked of him. That it wouldn't just be, go sacrifice your kid, which would put him into a state of confusion, and he would go, well, okay, I guess, and carry it out in a state of shock. No, this was laid out very clear, very deliberately, so that Avraham would understand. And indeed, the Midrash goes on to say, this also is a way to diffuse the arguments of others, that Abraham just went along with that without thinking, without knowing what he was doing. That no, it was laid out very clearly so that he would have the presence of mind to know exactly what he was agreeing to. But what was he agreeing to? Right? This V'ha'alehu, what was he agreeing to when he said offer him or bring him up? Well, God did not say slay him, right? That whole actual murder part, because the Holy One, blessed be he, did not desire that he should slay him. But he told him to bring him up to the mountain to prepare him as a burnt offering. So when he had taken him up, God said to him, bring him down. So as we've been saying back and forth, it was very deliberate that God did not use the phrase slay in the initial command, because God had no intention that there be an actual death at the end of this for Isaac. Instead, splitting the difference between many of the interpretations that we've had, God was asking him to bring up Isaac as though he were going to be offered, and then God would make it clear that indeed there was not going to be an offering of Isaac as a human sacrifice. And this formulation allowed that tension to rise, the need to be there, the feeling of the test, without the actual danger ever being ascribed as something that God would ever condone or support. So it gives us the drama, and more importantly, the clarity into Abraham's spirit, without actually thinking that our God ever wanted a human sacrifice. And that is why we can say then, with the next morning, Abraham saddled, we can see then Abraham's actions here are not rushed, they are not panicked, they are understanding, and he is setting about trying to do the best he can with a slightly unclear test, but one that he is nevertheless willing to carry out. And personally, from my mind, that is the greatest example of Abraham's faith. It was not so much his willingness to leave his homeland, his willingness to sacrifice Isaac, that is the greatest testament to Abraham's faith. It is his willingness to act on limited information and understanding, to do the best he can with what he thinks he is supposed to do. And that, I think, is why Abraham, more than Moses, has been the model for our own sense of faith throughout our lives, that we should model ourselves more on Abraham. Moses did not have the same level of doubt because Moses understood and connected to God differently than every other human who ever lived. Abraham, not that we are all like Abraham, but Abraham is at least more in our same category as somebody who heard God's commands, understood some, but not 100%, and acted the best he could within the boundaries of those mitzvot. And so too for us. There are often times we don't 100% understand what we are being asked to do. And at those times, we rely upon our faith and our tradition and our halakha, the understanding of the commandments, to do the best we can, and to always be ready to say hineni, to do or to change if it is clarified and we understand, put down the knife. Any additional questions and comments before we call it a day? Like I said, again, we are only scratching the surface, tip of the iceberg. Please go back. Safaria, like always, is a great resource, but there are many others as well about this whole section of the Akedah. All right, then I will say good afternoon to you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day. I hope to see you either in the Mishnah class tonight, the Pathways class tomorrow, or Shabbat services on Friday and Saturday, or any of the other amazing chances we have to be together. Take care, everyone, and be well.
Thank you.